Oh. Hello, welcome to this landscape demo for Kinsale Arts Weekend. It's not ideal how we're doing this. Obviously I would like to be actually using natural light. We're using gallery lights in the evening. But I'm just going to take through basically my palette and then basic rules of composition, mixing, basically how I make and produce a painting. So initially, I'm just going to go through my palette here. So I use the chromatic palette, which is basically 2 blues, 2 reds, 2 yellows and a white. So I use ultramarine blue and cerulean blue. You can change the cerulean blue with manganese. I mean, cerulean blue is quite expensive and I paint mainly in Ireland. You don't really need to use the cerulean blue. Manganese is a lot cheaper and does the same job, but I was out painting earlier and I do have the cerulean on my palette. Then we have vermilion and cadmium red. Again, you probably could just use one of these, but I find that the hue differences are helpful in certain situations. And then I use a cadmium yellow and a yellow ochre, and then titanium white. And this is the basic kind of landscape palettes. Like most painters would use something, a variant of this. They might have more reds, they might have more blues, depending on where they're painting in the world. But for Ireland, it's more than enough. You can really push this to really anything you see in Ireland. So yeah, I'm just going to crack on now with the basic, talking about composition. So, you know, you have the, basically, you know, a square or a rectangle, and basically you will have the given of horizontal lines. Now, horizontal lines, you want to break that as many times as you can. So if you have a basic horizontal, you know, this will always be the case. But you'll have, you know, obviously you have your horizon line, you're looking across, which is pretty much just your eye vision. And you're basically, just like, that will always occur. You know, you'll have multiples of these in a painting, and you know, so you want to have variation in any composition. So you're trying to find ways of breaking this. A good one would be like a telephone pole, something that comes, kind of, that shows that this plane is in the background, this plane is closer to you. And many other kind of things, like, you know, any way of breaking, like, you know, tree lines, etc., etc. If you are painting a tree line, you don't, you know, it's very easy to go on autopilot, where you basically make, you know, I do this all the time when I'm thinking about something else, and you'll just make all the trees the same height, or you'll make, you know, the distant mountain or whatever, you know, plane the same height as something else very close to it. It's just kind of how humans think. We kind of make patterns and we stick to patterns. So you always really want to be kind of observing and really seeing, like, in nature it will give you many variants of rhythms and so on. Like, the trees will never be the same height, even if they're man-made, there will be a rhythm in them. So yeah, I'll just go through a couple of compositional stems. These are just basic kind of classical starting points. Now you can mix them and you can change them in any way you want. They aren't by any means a dogma. They're just things to, you know, to help you start a painting. So, you know, one of the things you want to stop the viewer doing is to leave the plane of the picture. So you never want to have things coming into the corners. You know, you want the viewer's eye to basically be somewhere here, for multiple reasons. One of which is, you know, the longer someone looks at your painting, the more likely they are to buy it. So that's one of the things you could think about. But also the interest is held if the viewer is kept kind of transfixed or thoughtful on your picture. You don't want the eye to be travelling out of the picture plane. So a lot of these compositional stems would be variants of this. So basically, you know, you have a typical, like, a triangle, a circle. You have the very typical kind of steelyard, where you have, you know, a big mass, and along with a small mass. You see a lot of this in British school painting, Turner, Constable. And you can reverse that, you know, on upside down, Steelyard, the 3 dots, you know, just basically ways of varying, you know, like they wouldn't be the same. You generally don't want the same size of objects. You know, if you're seeing a house that's exactly in 50% of shadow, 50% of light, you want to break that. You want to like move to the side where it's, you know, you want more kind of variation generally. Unless, I mean, there's exceptions to every rule. These aren't really rules, but unless that like to make 3 things the same or 2 things the same, there's actually an artistic point. But generally, these are just good rules of thumb to talk about. So when painting outside, you generally have 4 planes. You have the ground plane, you have the tree plane, the sky plane, and then a mass of a hill or a mountain. Sometimes you might have a 5th plane, but generally speaking, these are the general planes you're viewing. And you think about it logically, as the sun comes down, obviously the floor plane is going to be the brightest generally from the sky hitting down. It'll be the brightest in the sense that it's receiving the most amount of light. Actually, I'll actually talk back on myself there in the sense that the sky will be the brightest part, but in terms of, I just mean in relation to a tree, in the sense that a tree will be basically being its own cast shadow, it will be darker. But what I just mean is that the light, like an open bit of ground, is exposed to all the sun's rays. So that's how we would basically, you want to assert the masses of that quite quickly and kind of cover and kill the white of the canvas. And besides that, these are like, obviously very, very basic compositional ideas. If you have the basic rectangle, and you don't want the viewer's eye to get to your focal point too quickly because it'll get bored and leave, and you also don't want the viewer's eye to get there too slowly because, like, for the same reason, it will get bored and leave. So you kind of want to tell a story, and you want maybe like a very simple idea would be if you had a church spire and then you had a meandering path to that spire. Obviously you don't want to make it really obvious, but on that path you would have points of small interest, whether that's a figure or, figure might not work because it might compete too much with the church spire. I mean, these are all kind of things to think about, but the main goal is you want to keep the viewer's eye somewhere there, and that would basically be the rule of thirds, where you break your plane into thirds, and then you generally put points of interest on the intersections of those third lines. So besides that, I'm just going to go on a little bit. We're going to be copying this painting. It's painting done in the evening here in Kinsale, and obviously this is not ideal at all because we have these lights onto what I'm painting, and then artificial light on again the subject. Outside, you would always want to basically not have direct sun on your panel, because you'd end up basically miskeying it. So you always want to have sky on your panel, so light obviously so you can see what you're doing, but you don't want to have direct sun. So you would always set up your easel in relation to that principle. So I'm just going to turn back these quick. So I just use basically a turpentine in one of these cups, and then I use a medium, which is basically a concoction of balsam, which is tree sap, linseed oil that's been kind of baked in lead trays, and then turpentine. And there's many recipes. If you contact me after, I can tell you the one I use. The recipe I used was the one I learned in Italy when I studied there. So it's going to bear with me for a second here. So I'm just going to be quickly going through this painting here. It's a dusk painting, and you would get kind of a lot of warms and kind of oranges in the evening. But I would just basically go through the small steps of how I would initially construct a painting. Going back to what I misspoke when I said the plane of the floor would be the brightest, I only meant in the sense that the light there would be no shade around it if it's like directly hitting the floor. In every painting you generally do outside, there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking the sky will be the lightest part. And like if you have the horizon line, everything, you have the sky, and everything below the sky is very dark in relation to the sky, except if it's white. But generally speaking, that's a good rule of thumb. If you can kind of remember that, you're doing well. So I would always keep the sky first. So I just get a little pool of turpentine, and I would add some of the medium. I use quite a lot of turp and quite a lot of medium at the beginning, just to cover the canvas and just to basically kill the white. Basically because it's the white that distracts the eye. So So you see I've gone a bit dark there. So let's talk a little bit about the technique. This is sight size, and again, we have to kind of make do with the situation we find ourselves in during these times. I can't show you exactly how it would work, but this is pretty much the principle. You have your canvas or page, whatever you're using, directly alongside what you're painting. So obviously if I was outside, this would be the countryside, and I would basically trying to get this mimicked over onto the canvas. It's super logical, and you flip your eye between the two, and it's basically just translating shapes that you see. Helps with a lot of things like proportion, perspective. So basically it's gone a little green. Just a bit of cerulean has a bit of a green hue, I always find, but that's probably, in this instance, you got contaminated, excuse me, with a bit of yellow. So I'm not going to copy it exactly, but I'm just going to go through. The brushes I basically use all filberts. So the three shapes you generally find on a brush are flat, round or point, and a filbert, and that's kind of in the middle. It has the joys of both those shapes. I very rarely use anything else. Sometimes I use a round, but nearly always they're filberts. Now this brush, the light brush, basically I would generally use kind of a similar brush, or maybe even the same brush, as I go into the far distant land, because it's going to be basically, with aerial perspective, it's going to be reasonably similar. And aerial perspective pretty much is the idea that as things recede, they get cooler and they get lighter. I mean, some people say they get lighter and bluer, but I think cooler is a better idea, because obviously things can get pinker as well, depending where you are. So basically, when I'm starting a painting, I'm not really obsessing about details. I'm not really, getting wrapped up in all that. I'm just trying to kill the white, trying to get my basic proportions down, and get the motif down, basically, you know, where things will be proportionally, and the idea down, which is what I mean by the, you know, the motif. So, you know, in this painting, I'm not overly concerned if it's exactly the right colour. Value is more important at this stage. And what I mean by value is, you know, is it, you know, how light and how dark it is in relation to the lightest light and the darkest dark. And we'll just go over that very quickly now. So, in any piece you do, you want to establish the lightest light and the darkest dark as quickly as possible, and that's kind of what we mean by keying. So, in this sense, I have to wait a little bit for the darkest dark, but the lightest light, if you squint at whatever you're painting, the lightest light is obviously the lightest thing you see when you squint, and then wherever is the darkest dark, and then you establish a value range, you know, and where things sit on that. So if that's your lightest light and that's your darkest dark, then you know where the midtones are more likely to be. It's more logical to see where they will fall. One of the biggest mistakes you see with beginning painters is they over-model, and either they do one of two things. Either they don't key early enough, they don't find their lightest light and their darkest dark, and then they basically go straight into the middle range, and they will invariably not make the right decisions because they aren't comparing it to anything. They don't know where, if that's darker than that, like if this is actually the right darkest relation to that, because they haven't found the extremities. Or they'll do the second thing where they will simply try and put too many values down. Now, when you're painting outside, you can't key to nature, which means you can't get things as dark and as light as nature, because obviously the nature's being lit by, you know, the sun, and we're using basically, you know, pigment. So we have to kind of not fake it, but kind of find kind of ways around that. So if you squint, reducing the amount of light coming into your eyes, you will see a value range that is more attainable. Now, a lot of people get confused on this, that they think you actually paint what you see when you squint. You don't really do that, because if you do that, you'd make everything too dark. You'd make basically a veil of grey over everything. You just basically squint to see, okay, that's darker than that, that's lighter than that, etc., 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 and you open your eyes and you paint it. Another thing I see with a lot of beginning painters is they do that. They basically make everything just this very grey. The paintings look quite grey, as if they're like there's a screen in front of them. Another reason we squint is that when you go outside, there's a multitude of things that's going on, and it's very overwhelming. And painting is picture making. You're editing nature. You can't put everything in, and if you could, it wouldn't work anyway. So what we do is we squint down and we try and find the most essential parts of what you're trying to paint. We also squint for light flow, soft and sharp edges. But I would say the two most essential things are for value and for simplicity, or simplifying what you're painting. So we'll talk a little about the brushes I use. I use these lovely hogs, which is pig hair from Cornelison's in London. They're quite pricey. They're 44s, they're green. Lovely brushes, Series 44 yet. They last you for a long time if you look after them, but they are a little pricey. And then I use sables, mainly bought from Zecchi in Florence, where I studied. And basically the simple way of thinking about it is hogs you put down, if you're doing a sculpture, this puts down flanks of clay and this kind of almost scalps them. I was always taught that you should put down, like you should basically use hogs nearly exclusively at the beginning and then slowly go on to sables. You know, I generally still follow that, though there are exceptions. So I'm going to use the same brush here for the distant land there, because they're going to be, it'll be darker, but it'll be a very similar hue. And I'll talk a little bit about colour in a second, but and again, this won't be that precise because I'm literally just running you guys through lots of different ideas about picture making here. So I think there's a bit more blue there. Now there's lots of kind of books on how to mix and so on and so forth. I generally just kind of, you know, add a bit here, you know, see what works, put it down. If it's not working, I tweak it. You know, there's lots of theories about mixing into dark, mixing into light, and I do that to an extent, but I generally just whatever works really. I find if I overthink about things and I think about too much theory, it generally for me cripples me and I can't paint. So I generally just try and, you know, allow the learned knowledge to kind of be embodied on the back burner and just paint. Okay, so. Now, generally you wouldn't want an horizon line to be exactly 50-50. Lots of things like that, like, you know, again, you can do whatever you want, but what is aesthetically interesting and interesting to the viewer is kind of what works, you know. And I think that's kind of, obviously to feel that, but things generally work and they don't without kind of too much explanation. Okay. So there's some basic trees in here, and again, these are just masses. I'm not really thinking about anything more than broad masses to be put down to the canvas. It's kind of like you make a mess and then you fix the mess. That's how I generally paint. I kill the white and then I start with more specificity. There's a couple of painters that I really admire who don't do this. They go straight for what it seems to be more specificity, and then there are large parts of the canvas that have left white all for a long time. So it's not how I like to work. Different strokes. Now, I generally think that you try and use a bit of paint. Like, don't paint with like little stains. It's far harder to correct. So I generally think that you should put down lots of paint within reason, obviously, because it makes it easier to correct. You know, if things are wrong. You have to be a bit brave. Yes, you can see this isn't ideal because some of the white has got quite into this green colour here. So I'm just going to change brush on this instance because it got contaminated from a previous mix. So I'm just generally going to draw the path here. This is a view in my hometown Kinsale, out to a pub called the Spaniard, did it about 5 years ago. So you see I'm kind of you know, flicking my eye between the two and just basically translating shapes. I'm not going up again, it's a demo, so I'm not going for extreme precision here. I'm just kind of talking as I paint and just bring you through. Now, this painting has a couple of figures in it, and it's talking about composition, talk about balance a bit. So again, if that was your picture plane, like if you overbalance the painting, and you have like a massive tree, say here, a path, and you have this kind of floating space, obviously it's not particularly good composition because it's basically unbalanced. There's many ways you could resolve that, but one of the ways you can do it is actually to do one small mark that resembles something, and that's a figure. And that's basically one of the reasons it works so well is we were so obsessed with us as humans that it kind of psychologically it completely balances a painting. So in this one you have actually you have three figures. So if that was, I could just put like some happening here, and it would basically write the image. That would be, now it would somewhat work more. You know, obviously all these basic compositional stems need to be worked upon and, you know, felt, not just kind of done by kind of rote. So you can see I'm not really going for obsessing on too much colour here, I'm just going for masses. So basically we have the sky plane, the hill, like the distant hill, and then we have trees, and then the ground. That's pretty much our four planes. Kind of a good way to think about things, at least when you're laying in. Now, in terms of brushes, you want to basically use quite reasonably big brushes, like big brush, big mark. You don't want to be using like loads of very small things, especially when you're laying in. Like obviously you use the smaller brushes when the breadth has been put down, and then you're building more towards specificity. And you know, you need to have, like, you know, an analogy would be, you know, the house has kind of the structure of the house, and the like all the kind of architecture within the house has to work and like be stable. Doesn't really, like, it's still going to fall down if you do all like pretty things on the exterior. So this is like the bit you really want to be really structuring the painting. I'm using these very, very ultra light panel here, so which is why it's bending so much. So in terms of, probably a little bit early to talk about this, but it's worth talking about. Talking about kind of compression of values. So again, it's hard to talk about this because we're inside copying another painting. But if you're outside, you're looking at, you should always at least look at three things together, or probably more. So if you stare at two things, so if you go outside and you're painting the sky and you see a cloud next to the blue of the sky, or whatever colour the sky might be that day, what a lot of people do is they'll stare at that difference and then nearly always make it wrong, because they're myopically staring at just the difference in value between the sky and the cloud. Where if you look at the sky and the cloud along with everything else, you will realise that the cloud to the blue of the sky are very close in value. Same when you look at a tree in shadow and in light, the darker between the light and the two are actually very, very close as well. So what you want to do is you want to look at them together, and then in periphery or as well look at everything in relation to that, and you'll see that they're actually very near. And that's what we mean by compression of values. If you basically, yeah. And what are you telling the viewer about the painting? The mood, the initial idea. I'm really only talking about basic prose here. I'm not talking about how you feel about the world or all these more poetic things. These are just basic rudimentaries of starting a plein air painting. A little bit about colour now. So a lot of people think in painting that colour is the most important thing. I slightly disagree with this. I think the most important thing is value, or be between value and basically shapes, how well you can draw. They would be competing for first and second with me. Thirdly would be colour. I don't use a great deal of colour. They aren't muted. Well, they're reasonably muted, my paintings. But a good way of thinking about colour is that, if everyone's used Photoshop, you'll be familiar with this, but you have three basic principles of colour. You have hue, which is where it sits on the colour wheel, how far it bleeds into one, and so on and so forth. You have value, how dark that colour is, and then you have saturation or chroma, which would mean how intense that colour is. And you can change one of them without affecting the other two. Kind of sounds a bit counterintuitive, but again, go on Photoshop, if you bring the dials across, you'll know what I mean. And again, how you use colour in some degree is quite personal. Obviously, there are real colours as you go outside, and they will be changing always. Whereas in a studio situation, you can control the light outside, everything bouncing together. So one of the ways you think about that's helpful is that colours change all the time, but the relationships between those colours do not the relationships between the colours don't really change, in the sense that they will change together, if that makes sense. So colours will always change, but the relationship between them won't change. So if one changes, it'll change and relate to something else. And the more you paint outside, the more you'll understand this. Obviously things like, things in the foreground are going to be warmer and dark, and basically obviously more detail as well. As things recede, they'll get less warm, as I said, with the out perspective. They will become cooler and less defined. And this is another way of giving the illusion of depth in a painting. So traditionally, landscape painting especially is to do with depth. Portrait painting was usually to do with just basically getting a lightness, at least in principle, and then still life was about textures and how you show off different, the skill of showing off those things. But in landscape painting, it's basically devices to give the illusion of depth in a painting. As I mentioned, things like breaking the horizontal, and using things like as things recede, atmosphere, good way of thinking about aerial perspective is if you had a set box, like an acting set box where you have like many different sets stacked behind each other. If you had lots of veils of silk, obviously the more veils of silk, the lighter it will become as there's more kind of veils of atmosphere obscuring the distant objects. It's a good way of thinking about it. And you want to kind of stay away from local colours, like, you know, in the sense that, like, if something is red, it's only, like, it'll never be the same shade of red, like exactly the same time necessarily, depends on what light is hitting it. So you can kind of go for, you know, a relative colour of something else and how the light is hitting it and whatever distance that object is being hit by light. So you're kind of thinking about how light hits things and how it plays with hue and value and so on and so forth. So as you can see, I'm not being that precious here. I'm just killing the canvas. So we'll go about things like diffraction. So it's basically the principle of whenever a light gets to a dark, it generally gets a little darker, and vice versa. So, you know, when the sky hits a tree, the light of the sky will get a little bit darker as it comes to the cusp of the tree, and the cusp of the leaf will get a little bit lighter, assuming it's darker. to the sky and vice versa. And this is basically a way of, in my art school there's a lot of talk about blurring and softening, and because we were all very interested in Velasquez, and I'm very interested in blurring as well, but one thing I would stress to people painting is the difference between softening and blurring. So softening is, well, I should always talk about blurring first. Blurring is basically just, it's not particularly skillful. In lots of ways you're kind of just obscuring and you're just saying, I'm not entirely sure, or I want it to be diffuse or blurred there, and I'm bringing my finger through it or a brush. Softening, on the other hand, how I'm finding it, is actually very skillful in the sense you're finding planes, you're seeing how planes change, and you're seeing the difference in value or hue. Now, if you can do it with hue and not value, all the better. If you cannot use a value, but you can use a hue instead, I think that's sophisticated painting. But yeah, so when you put something down, you can leave it very, very sharp in one sense, as long as you're happy with the eye being led there, and also the fact that you've done the softening work near it. Optically, it will still appear not too intrusive if you don't want it to be intrusive. There's a lot more to talk about that particular subject, but I sometimes see students where they basically just do a beautiful bit of painting or drawing, and then they blur it, even though they're at a stage of the painting where they don't necessarily need to. Generally speaking, you don't want things to dry sharp because they're very hard to then make soft. So it's a good rule of thumb: when you're in doubt, you're not entirely sure when something wants to be what you're doing with a certain bit, then you blur it. But sometimes I feel that can bleed into like just blurring everything. So you want to think about the difference between blurring and softening, and why you leave something sharp, you know. And at the beginning of a painting, it's good to just basically at the end of that session blur most things, because you're not entirely sure, you know, unless you're very experienced, you're not always that entirely sure what to be left. But that's just worth thinking about. Yeah, I'm not particularly occupied with how precise what I'm doing here is. It's just you can see what I've done is not too precise in lots and lots of ways, but you gotta get the idea that, you know, what is darker than what else, and so on. These are just the basic masses. So you start with breadth, and you build in specificity, as I said before, and you basically don't be too precious in your laying. Like, try and be very precise, but don't be too overly precious. And for colour, it goes without saying that you paint colours with your eyes open. You know, you squint for the value, but to see the colour, you would always have your eyes open. Also, it's picture making in the sense as well that you're composing as well as just, you know, you're not merely copying, you're designing a picture. So, you know, if something's not working or is jarring, feel free to omit it. You know, there are schools of painters that basically they would walk around an area, just find the exact angle for everything and without omitting things. It's not how I paint. I basically, if something's not working or I don't like it, I just do not put it in. And, you know, one of my sayings is that painting's far more about editing than it is about adding, which is broadly true. Now in this painting I'm just trying to go through what the darkest dark would be. So it was painted in the evening time, so I'd say the darkest dark would probably, if I squinted it, which is again not ideal working solely from a painting on the wall, but it would be probably the shadows in the brickwork here. So I'm just going to put them in, even though I haven't even painted the wall, just to give you guys an idea of what I'm talking about with value, and then we'll wrap it up after that. Now, I don't use black to get dark hues, but I generally would use ultramarine. If I wanted something really dark, ultramarine, a bit of cadmium red, which goes purple. To kill the purple, you throw in a little bit of cadmium yellow. And if that's still not dark enough, which it generally is, you can use a bit of viridian green, but I've never really found to need that. That's just something I was told. So you generally have, this would be the darkest point, that will be the lightest point, and then you kind of have a value scale. When I'm painting, I don't really think like that. I just basically paint now because I've been doing it for such a long time. But there's lots of ways again of painting sky. Do you put the sun rays? How much handling do you leave? These are all kind of taste things. But as I say, this demo is generally just about the basics of picture making. And you always want to be standing back. I mean, ideally I'd be basically locking my head and flicking it across, but every now and then I do step back, and that's vitally important. And also to take breaks is vitally important. Don't look at the painting, go for a brief walk, have a conversation with a friend, anything. You look at Facebook, whatever you're doing. Obsessing over, about something like in a long period of time without breaks is generally, at least for me, a recipe for disaster. You become myopic, just tunnel vision. Okay, well, might as well throw a little figure in here just to, let's see that. Again, perspective here could be better, but let's throw a little figure. Again, like when you put down things, try and be precise, more precise than I was just there. But, don't be obsessed that it has to be exactly right the initial time you put it down. You put things down, you tweak them, you change them, and you design with them sometimes as much on the canvas as they are on the palette. So don't, if not more. So, always try and do your best, but you always can tweak things. Oil paint's very forgiving. Unlike something like watercolour, where your wash kind of has to be right the first time you put it down, the more you do to it, sometimes it can just look a lot worse. Oil paint has a lot of forgiveness to it. And you can also rework in oil painting a lot without risking the surface too much. Okay guys, thank you for tuning in or watching this video. Hope you enjoy Kinsale Arts Weekend, and if you ever want to chat in more depth about any of these things, you can find me on Kit French Portraits on Instagram. Just give me a message or call in to the gallery 23. Hope I didn't ramble too much, but thank you very much and enjoy your day.